Hello, my name's Jerome Richardson. I am with Bellevue University and the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Memorial Foundation. We are here today in Kearney, Nebraska at the public library, and we're with the Vietnam veteran Ronald Keith. And Keith is going to share his story with us. And Keith, if you can introduce yourself and maybe share where you were born and a little bit of your growing up, we'll start with that.
Okay. My name is Ronald Keith Lane, and my dad's name was Keith, and the family called me Keith, and it stuck. Born in Moline, Illinois in 1945, and Dad was called back into the Marine Corps when the Korean War broke out in 1950. He was a chiropractor and had been able to practice for 1 year after the Second World War. He was a Marine and during the war, and was in the first wave to hit the Tarawa beachhead. And when he got hit on the beach, he rolled around and screamed for a medic, and so many guys were hurt and dead that there were no medics available. When he finally looked at himself, he found out it was only a scratch, and he ran on up the beachhead. But my whole family was kind of military. I had one uncle in the Army, Dad's brother, who was a combat medic in Europe. I had another uncle in the Navy on my mom's side, her brother, and then her other brother was in the Merchant Marine. And then he was the one that was sunk twice. Ended up swimming. And I had an uncle that was my mother's sister's husband that finally retired as a lieutenant after being in the Navy for more than 20 years and never learned how to swim. My son was a helicopter pilot in Iraq, 3 tours. My nephew is a helicopter pilot. He retired from the Army Reserve as a major, and my grandson now is getting ready to go into the Marine Corps towards the end of the month. So we're a well-established military family. But because Dad was called back into the Marine Corps in 1950, we moved all over the United States during that time. We went first to San Diego and back to Lamoni, Iowa to live with my grandparents while Dad went to Korea right after the Korean War was over. And when he got back from there, we moved back to San Diego and then up to Oceanside where he worked at Camp Pendleton. From there, we went back to Moline, Rock Island area in Illinois where he was a recruiter. And when Lebanon crisis hit, he was called down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and we went down there. So we stayed in the South for 3 years, and my Yankee accent got all screwed up because I lived in the South for so many years. But when we finally moved back to Illinois, and he went to Okinawa on a tour and came back, he retired, and I went to 1 semester of college, decided that wasn't for me, came back, started another semester at home, and finally had enough of that, and I hitchhiked out to my girlfriend's house and asked her dad if I could spend a couple of days. I borrowed her sister's car and went in on a Monday to enlist in the Army. I figured if the Marine Corps did that to my dad, I didn't want any part of it. But my girlfriend turned out to be my wife, and tomorrow is our 58th anniversary.
Very neat.
So I trained initially as heavy weapons infantry, and once I finished with the training, I had already applied for helicopter flight school by that time and was at Fort Gordon, Georgia, waiting on the results of that when I got orders to go to Korea. Well, the process of the application for flight school had already been completed, and I was just waiting on an answer. And when I got to Korea on the ship, they told us that we had to take a landing craft into the harbor because the harbor was too shallow at Incheon. And so when we got to the docks on the landing craft, they made us wait there until they passed out mail. And in that mail, I had my acceptance to flight school. So they assigned me as a heavy weapons, not a heavy weapons, a machine gunner in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 17th Infantry. It was the 7th Division. We were the furthest unit north at Camp Kaiser in South Korea. We were north of the parallel, actually. And the DMZ kind of runs at a diagonal there. So we were actually about 8 miles from the DMZ. And when I finally got my orders to go to flight school in November, I took a plane back to Kansas City for a little leave, and my girlfriend met me on the ramp, and which you could do at that time. You can't do that now, but as we were walking back across the ramp, she says, "Guess what we're going to do?" I said, "What are we going to do?" She says, "We're going to get married." I said, "Oh, okay." And so we drove up to Matherville, where her family lives, and she says, "Dad, get the church ready, and Mom, get ready for everything you need to do." So 3 or 4 days later was the 7th of November, which is tomorrow, and we were married by her father in the little church in Matherville, Illinois. So I went to flight school. She went back to nurses training, and over Christmas we had a break, and after Christmas she decided she's going to come to join me and quit nurses training. I didn't know it because she'd sent me a note first by special delivery. Well, I only got my mail every couple of days because it was quite a ways to go to get to the post office, and we only had boxes. We didn't have delivery. So I saw that letter and I called home, and I didn't see the letter until after I called home. And she says, have you got a place for me to live yet? And I said, what are you talking about? She says, I'll be down there tomorrow. I said, what? So I went to my company commander, explained the situation to him. It was a Friday evening, so Saturday morning he let me off to go pick her up and find a place for her to live. So I did that, and we spent the next 4 months at Fort Walters, Texas, in Mineral Wells. And in the evenings, if I maintained my grade point average above 90, she could come in and visit me on post. So that's what we would do. She came in and picked me up at the company, and we drove around post. And of course, we found some out-of-the-way places to be alone. And
quick question for you there. At Fort Walters, was that the flight school then?
that was flight school.
Okay, thank you.
That was the first half of flight school, because you spent 1 month as pre-flight and the next 4 months flight, and then from there you either went to Fort Rucker, Alabama, or Fort Stewart, Georgia. I went to Fort Rucker after I was done. I was what they called a snowbird, because they held me over for 1 month before I went to Fort Rucker. And during that month, they assigned me to work at the Fort Walters stables. So that was a really tough job. I had to ride horses almost every day. But at Fort Walters, we learned the basics of helicopter flying. We had 2 types of helicopters that were in use there. There was a TH-55, which was lovingly called the Mattel Messerschmitt, and the OH-23 Hiller. and I don't even remember what that was called, but I was in the TH-55. And then going to Fort Rucker, started out in an OH-13, which was the instrument trainer. We had a tactical instrument ticket at that time that taught us the basics of instrument flying. And then we went into UH-1 transition, and that was about a month, maybe two. No, it was a month. Instruments was 2 months, transition was 1 month, and then tactics was the last month in flight school. And we celebrated tactics by a huge flyover. There was probably at least 75, maybe 100 helicopters in this huge formation that flew over Fort Rucker the day before we all graduated. And that afternoon, I got my warrant officer bar, and the next day I got my wings. And then I went to Fort Bragg, and we formed up the 191st Assault Helicopter Company at Fort Bragg. It became part of the 82nd Aviation Battalion, 82nd Infantry Division, Airborne. And we stayed there from November of 66 until May of 67. And then we all flew over to Vietnam. We went to Bearcat, and they split us up. After about a week or so, I went over to Cu Chi, and I flew the 116th Hornets and Stingers for about 2 weeks. And I'm telling you, after flying in the U.S. for 6 or 7 months and thinking I was pretty hot, it was a real wake-up when the aircraft commander at the 116th told me the first time to pick it up to a hover, and it wouldn't stay there. And I said, I can't make it stay up. So he took the controls, picked it up to a hover, and it stayed there. And I said, how'd you do that? He says, look, you just use these 2 fingers on a cyclic. And I couldn't hardly see him move, but he made it stay there. So I finally mastered that technique. And from there, after a couple of weeks, went back to Bearcat. I did no flying there. They sent me to Nha Trang, who sent me over to Pleiku, the 52nd Combat Aviation Battalion, Flying Dragons. And they sent me down to Bamituit with the 155th Assault Helicopter Company. Now everybody starts out flying slicks. That's the UH-1H. They had H models. And after several months of flying slicks, I went into guns. And the Falcons were the guns. The stagecoaches were the slicks. And I've got some pictures. I didn't bring them though. But the stagecoach patch is basically the U.S. flag hanging vertically beside the Vietnam flag hanging vertically with a helicopter and a crossbow on it. And then the banner at the bottom said 155th Assault Helicopter Company. Across the top it said stagecoaches. The Falcons were a blue patch that had a fist holding a falcon on the wrist, and that was our gun patch. Some people called us gun bunnies. Some people just called us gunners, gunnies. And it was an interesting time. Had a couple of stories flying slicks. We, unbeknownst to some people, had LRP teams. They were long-range reconnaissance patrols that would go to observe the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. And we would take the LERP teams over there. Well, I took one in that was down below the trees, and I couldn't land because of the trees. We had what was called a triple canopy jungle, and there was actually layers between the tops of the trees. And so in this one particular area, I had to hover down between the trees and slide over to another hole, hover down some more, slide back over to another hole, and down some more. And finally the troops in the helicopter could go out on a rope. Well, one of those guys decides he's going to be smart and jump into a creek. He stopped his rope on top of a tree, and he was going to jump down into a creek, and it turned out the creek was only 6 inches deep. He broke his leg. So we had to tie him onto the bottom of the rope, lift him up through the trees, drag him through the trees as we slid over, up some more, drag him through the trees some more, and up some more so we could get out of them. And finally get up high enough to where we could fly away and find a place where we could put him inside the helicopter. Well, on the way to finding the place to put him inside, some guys started shooting at us with a quad 50. And this guy on the rope was carrying a Swedish K across his chest, and he was kind of streamlined on a rope around his waist. And the crew chief started laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" Because this quad 50 was shooting at us, and he's laughing. I said, "What are you laughing at? What's so funny?" He says, "Well, the guy down there is trying to shoot too, and every time he pulls the trigger, he turns around in a circle." So, so we finally found a place to put him inside, and we got him back to a medic, so he was taken care of. There was another time we dropped a LERP team in, and no sooner did we drop them in, but they called us and said they'd been ambushed, and their team lead was killed, and we need to pick them up again. Well, there was no place to pick them up, so they tied det cord, which is explosive that you tie around a tree, and when you set it off, it blows the tree up. Well, they had enough trees that we could land, but we couldn't actually touch down because of too many stumps in the area. So while they were all climbing on the helicopter, there was a VC across the LZ from us shooting at us, and all these bullets are making pock marks in front of the helicopter. We figured out later that's because they were always told to shoot ahead of the helicopter. When it's flying, you got to shoot ahead so you can hit it. Well, he was doing what he was told and shooting in front of the helicopter. And I'm just as glad too, because we were facing him. And it would not have been fun if he knew better. But on our way out of that LZ, one of the guys was so upset that he fired off all of his ammunition at this guy. And then he grabbed another rifle and he fired all that ammunition. And when he'd finally fired all the ammunition in the helicopter, he started throwing grenades out. And when he threw all the grenades that he had, he leaned around, he grabbed a hold of a post, he leaned out and shook his hand out, and he says, "I'll be back, you son of a..." And that was all. So there was some good experiences there. I'd say good, they're interesting anyway. But as a gun pilot, I had a couple of good experiences too. My lieutenant was a team lead one day when I was following him and he made a turn. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll go up and turn where he turned and follow him like a good little follower. And about the time I was in the middle of a turn, I had 4 rounds come through the cockpit. My co-pilot got shot in the leg. And when he jerked up, he knocked the cyclic out of my hand. And so we started going down in a left descending turn, and I just instinctively reached up, grabbed the cyclic, and it responded. So I thought, well, okay, we're not going to die today. And so I called and told him that my co-pilot Jerry had been shot in the leg and we had to go back to base. He says, by the way, I forgot to tell you we got some ground fire back there where we returned. I said, thanks a lot. So we returned back to base and Jerry got the help that he needed. He was out for about 3 weeks and came back and finished his tour with us. But on the way back to base, that bullet dropped out of the bottom of his leg and he got to keep that souvenir. So there was another time when the same lieutenant was the flight lead. We had attacks going on 2 ends of our gun runs. Normally we would dive in at a gun at a target and climb out and then turn around and come back and dive in and attack the target again. Well, in this case, we had a target on this end and a target on that end. So we'd climb as much as we could, we'd roll in on the next one. We had green tracers coming all over the place. Green is Chinese communist. So we knew that we were having a lot of ground fire because we could see it coming. When we finally ran out of ammunition, we landed, and I normally screwed rockets together. There was a warhead, about a 10-pound warhead, you screwed onto a rocket body that was probably 3.5 feet or so long and 2 3/4 inches around. And that rocket went back into the tube to be fired again. But I had a technic inspector come over and ask me, he says, hey Chief, have you checked your rotor head yet? And I said, no. I knew I had some holes in the aircraft, but they weren't important. They didn't hit anything vital. He says, okay, I'll go up and check it for you. So while I'm screwing more rockets together, he hollered at me, he says, come up and look at this. So I climbed up on top of the helicopter and looked, and right in the middle of a scissors assembly, which is the stabilizer bar that goes across the very top of the rotor head, there's a piece about yay wide that holds those 2 bars in place, and in the center they pivot. Right in the middle of that was a hole about that big around. And it was cracked all the way through on the bottom and about halfway through on top. And if I tried to take off, it might have held together another 5 minutes and then it'd be done. And we would have crashed. Well, for that action, the lieutenant got a Silver Star and all us warrants and everybody else got a V device for our air medal. Oh well. But we had a free fire zone, which didn't require any kind of permission to fire on targets. If you found water buffalo moving in a line, you shot them, killed them, because water buffalo don't naturally move in a line. They were cargo, and the Viet Cong would tie themselves and their cargo on the bottom of a water buffalo. And sometimes if you'd shoot at a line of water buffalo like that, they'd shoot back. So you knew they weren't just water buffalo. Well, a little place called Baulock, which is 75 miles or so south of Bamituit in the Central Highlands, was a MAC-V compound. And they had a free fire zone just east of them. So we were out in this free fire zone looking for targets of opportunity one day. And we found a garden and a hooch built beside it. And there were some canoes in a river that was real close by. So we figured, you know, we have to deprive the enemy of a means to sustain themselves in that area. So we shot up the garden, we blew it up with rockets, and then the same way with the hooch that was built beside it. And we decided we're going to destroy those canoes too. So we shot them up with a minigun and let the gunner and the crew chief shoot at them with the M60s out the door. And then we decided, well, we're not getting anywhere visibly with those, so let's shoot a rocket at them. So I rolled the helicopter in and I pointed it at those canoes and I pushed the button to fire the rocket, and something terrible happened. The thing blew up just as it cleared the tube, and the helicopter started shaking like this. My co-pilot looked out the side of his door, and the left skid, the toe was gone. The toe is the part that comes up, and there's a piece across the top you can step on to get in the cockpit, or in my case, I sit on it when we're down on the ground. But it was gone. And the cross tube that comes under the helicopter would hold that skid in place, and the skid was hanging down like this. So I thought, well, we have a choice, guys. We can either sit down out here, be captured, and maybe killed, or we can fly in to base, which is about 10 miles away, and we can try to set it down there, or we can take our chances. What do you want to do? Well, everybody voted, let's fly back to Balak. So we got back, and the crew chief got out. By the way, his name was Paul Fades, F-A-D-Z. And Paul jumped out, and he wiped off some of this propellant that was on him that I didn't know whether it was blood or what it was. Because when I looked back, I saw him covered in this red, and I said, "Are you okay?" He says, "I don't know." And the gunner reached over and he touched him, and he stuck it on his tongue, and he says, "Yeah, it's not blood." So it must have been the rocket propellant. The motor had blown up. So when we got back to Balak, Paul jumped out. He made sure that skid went back up in the cross tube where it belonged in order to keep the helicopter from rolling over, and maybe put some sandbags under that side too. So then one other time we had standby, and standby was so that if you had a mortar attack, you could take off and go find the mortar team that was shooting at us. Well, I was on second standby, so we were allowed to drink during that time. I didn't drink, but my co-pilot did. And first standby usually went out and then came back, and that was it. That particular night, we were called out on second standby. And I found the target, rolled in. I told my co-pilot, "Shoot." He says, "No." His head was killing him. He'd had too much to drink, and it was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So he had a terrific headache. No, he did not want to pull that trigger. So I had a little switch on the console. I could flip and switch the guns to stowed and roll in like a fighter and pull the trigger on my cyclic, and it would shoot. And when I pulled that trigger, he screamed, "Ah!" And I told him, "You should not drink when you're on standby." And he finally learned his lesson. Well, after my tour in Vietnam, they sent me back to Fort Walters as an IP and an OH-23. I knew nothing about OH-23s except they were hard to fly. And sure enough, that first day in my instructor course, the IP told me to pick it up to a hover, and I didn't know anything about it. He says, "Look, this thing flies just like any other helicopter, but it's a little slower. So just pick it up, don't worry about it." So I pulled up on the collective, and we came up to a hover, and I'm wiping out the cockpit trying to keep that thing in one place. He said, "I got the controls." He took them, and the helicopter settled down. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "It's just like Vietnam. You have to move small movements." And he takes his finger again like this. I could see him moving this time, but he's just holding that helicopter real steady. He says, "Watch this." And he takes his cyclic and goes like this, and the helicopter never moved. Well, the heller did not have direct control to the rotor blades through the collective or the cyclic. They had big paddles up there. And the paddles were about yay wide, kind of square, on a crossbar to the helicopter, to the rotor blades. And that's what moved the rotor system. So when you moved your cyclic, in that TH55, you move like this, and the result was like 70 degrees before it moved. That's pretty fast. The Huey was 180 degrees. And it's not slow, but it's not like the little TH55. Well, the OH-23 was about 270 degrees before it kicked in. So you make a move here and it kicks in over here. And so it was a little harder for me to learn how to fly, but eventually I did. And we had students. Now later on, IPs worked all day, and they had 2 students, one in the morning, one in the evening. Later, but during my time, we had 4 students, and we split our time between those 4. One would go out for an hour, and we'd land at a stage field, which was a practice airport for helicopters. And a second student would climb in while the first one went and sat out the rest of his day. And then we would trade off like that every hour. So by 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was done. I could go home. And it was the same way at night when we flew nights. But I had, from June of '68 through September of '69, that's what I did, was teaching helicopter pilots how to fly. We had 2 phases at Fort Walters. We had the basic phase, which was when they really learned how to fly, and then the primary phase, which was what I was, when we did confined areas. We did slopes, we did pinnacles. Pinnacle is on top of a hill. Slopes is on the side of a hill, of course. And so the rest of my time in the Army for that first session was there at Fort Walters. When I got out, I was looking for a job. I got on with Jackson County, Missouri Sheriff's Department, and then went to Kansas City, Kansas PD after they had a budget cut. And during my time with the police department, we got 2 helicopters. And I was transferred over to that unit to fly with the police department for about 8 years. And interestingly, the helicopters that we got were Hughes 300s, which was a different version of the TH-55. And I had no problem flying those. After 9.5 years with the police department, I went to Kansas Highway Patrol and started flying Cessna 182s for them after about a year on the patrol. Now, shortly before the Sheriff's Department had a big budget cut, I went with the Kansas National Guard, and again, flying OH-23s. And they had 1 Huey that only the inner circle could fly. So I was going to college. I was working full-time at the police department by then. My last semester in college was 5 o'clock in the morning, driving from Kansas City, Kansas on the west side to Independence, Missouri, down to Warrensburg and taking classes there. The first hour, my classmate had classes, but I did not. So I used that hour to either study or take a nap, whichever I needed worse. my classes went from 9 to 12. So from 12 to 2, I studied or took a nap, whichever I needed worse. And then when my classmate came back, we drove back to Independence. And then I was always in my uniform because I went straight to work on the police department. And I worked from 4 until midnight. So 4 to midnight, sometimes it would be 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, depending on what was going on. And then I'd get up at 5 again, and it would start all over. So the last semester was extremely busy for me. And my younger daughter came in one day when I had a holiday, and she looked at me, she looked at my wife, looked at me, looked back at my wife, and finally she says, "Mommy, who's that?" So I figured, well, something's got to go. I couldn't quit school, I couldn't quit my job, and I wasn't about to quit my church. So the National Guard had to go. So for a couple of years after that was just work and church, because I graduated in June of that year, got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. I was always told psychology was a good thing to know as a policeman. So I forget what month it was. I think it was April or May. I got a call one morning from a Major Jurgen, who was the commander of a Chinook unit in Olathe, Kansas. And he says, "You were recommended to me as one of the guys that I might call to fill a pilot slot that we have here." And so I said, "Well, I don't know, Major. I appreciate the call, but I'm not sure." He said, "Well, you're welcome to come down and visit, and you can make a decision later if you want." So I said, "Okay, thank you." And I told Margaret, I said, "Well, let's just drive down and see what the facility is like." So we drove down there, and I walked into that hangar with these huge aircraft, helicopters, with a rotor front and back. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Hon, I'm sorry, I got to fly one of these." And so I joined the unit. And those CH-47 Chinooks were quite the aircraft. Very, very big compared to anything I've flown before. And it would float. That helicopter would float. And we would take it out on a lake. And the left main gear acted like a rudder. We had a little knob on a console that would steer that wheel. And that's what we used to go around on the ground with, too. That was our steering wheel. But that left main gear acted as a rudder on the lake. And so we always flew with the top half of the tailgate down inside the gate. And the flight engineer was in the back, the crew chief was in the front. The flight engineer would lay on that gate and tell us if we got too close to the water. So one day we're out on the lake practicing our maneuvering around on the water, and the flight engineer calls me and he says, "Sir, we're getting a little too close to the water." So I decided, all right, he's paranoid. I'm going to show him what it's like to be too close to the water. So I put a little bit of aft cyclic in. And he says, "Sir, we're getting a little too close. Sir, we're getting really..." So he got a little wet. So it was fun flying those helicopters. But I went on to Kansas Highway Patrol, and I soon found that driving 3.5 hours up to Olathe from Wichita was a bit much. And so I got in the unit there. And they had a U-8, which is a twin-engine Beechcraft Queen Air. And so when I tried to get in the unit there, the lieutenant colonel at the time said, "Oh no, this is too complicated of an airplane. You will never be able to fly this airplane." And one of the guys that I flew with in Olathe said, "Colonel, what's more complicated? Your aircraft weighs how much?" He says, 7,500 pounds. It's a lot bigger than a Huey. Well, no, it wasn't. The Huey gross weight was 9,500. But the Chinook was 33,000. That was an A model Chinook. And so my friend says, "Well, how many passengers does your U-8 hold?" "Well, the 2 pilots and the 4 passengers." He says, "Colonel, that Chinook will hold 33 combat troops, which means all our gear too." "Oh, well." He said, "How many emergency procedures do you have to memorize for that U-8? He said, "Oh, well, we got to memorize 7 or 8. He says, "There's probably 11 or 12 on that Chinook." "Which is a more complicated aircraft, do you think?" "Oh, well, okay." So I got in the unit to fly the U-8, which is fixed wing, as I said. It was a Beechcraft Queen Air with turbocharged engines, the IO 540 engines. Later, they changed those engines out to normally aspirated IO 720s. The aircraft would go faster, but it took longer to take off, and it would land about the same distance. But we flew missions all over the place. And I eventually went AGR, which is an active guard or reserve, in 1988. And again, we flew missions all over the U.S. in that U-8. Well, eventually they had to get rid of all the U-8s, and the Army Reserve was flying U-21s. So since we had to get rid of our U-8s, one of them went to the Civil Air Patrol in Amarillo, Texas. The other went to the Kansas Aviation Museum in Wichita, right outside McConnell Air Base on the west side. So the last 4 of us in the unit have our name painted on the side of the cockpit on that U-8 that's in the Kansas Aviation Museum. So I got transferred out to NAS Willow Grove, and the Army Reserve unit was placed on the backside of the Navy base, along with the Marines, and we were flying U-21s. So eventually we got rid of the U-21s, we got C-12s. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pick up a brand new C-12 from the factory in Wichita. So we had new aircraft, new navigation systems, new everything. We had a primary navigation system was GPS, which the active Army did not have at that time. And about a year after we picked up the aircraft, Bosnia broke out. So in 1996, in January, we sent 3 airplanes over to Bosnia. Not Bosnia, but Germany, Heidelberg, so that they could support missions into Bosnia, because the Air Force had set up all the navigation points along the way to get in Sarajevo and Tuzla as GPS, and the active Army did not have GPS in their airplanes. So ours did. We got sent over to do that. So in March, we sent 3 more airplanes. So me and another pilot command were sent over. We flew 2 airplanes over, kind of in formation. We flew from Philadelphia at NES Willow Grove, which was actually in Horsham, which is another northern suburb of Philadelphia. And we went from NES Willow Grove to St. John, Newfoundland, spent the night. From St. John we went to Keflavik, Iceland, and spent the night. From Keflavik we went to Mildenhall, England, and spent the night and then flew about an hour and a half over to Heidelberg, where we were based for the next 9 months. And we flew missions to Bosnia, all over Germany, Belgium. We flew into SHAPE headquarters several times. We had a detachment in Naples, Italy, supporting the assistant NATO commander down there, which was a Navy admiral. So we flew down to Italy. We flew into Macedonia, Albania, and we even had a mission that I did not get to fly, but one of the other crews did, to Ukraine. And so we supported a lot of troops. I went into Sarajevo one day, excuse me. Getting a little hoarse. Went into Sarajevo one day, and a Russian pilot flew an IL-76 into Sarajevo. We had a U.S. Air Force major that was an interpreter that spoke Russian. And he was interpreting as me and this Russian colonel were talking back and forth. And the major got a phone call, so he had to leave. So the major and I continued to talk. He didn't speak English, I didn't speak Russian, but we told each other about our airplanes. And when the major came back, he says, "How'd you and the colonel get along?" I said, "We get along fine." He said, "What'd you talk about?" I said, "I told him about my C-12. He told me about his IL-76. And so he talked to the colonel a little bit, and he turned back to me and he says, "I'll be darned." He says, "You guys neither one know what you're talking about with the other, but you told each other and you both understood." So, so eventually we got to go down and visit each other's airplane, and I showed him mine and he showed me his, and he was duly impressed with my little C-12 and how modern it was, because I had an all-glass cockpit and his was all analog. He used celestial navigation and I used GPS. So my airplane, even though it was smaller and didn't go as fast as his, almost as fast, was much more modern, much better equipped than his big cargo airplane. And he was very much impressed with it. So, but as it turned out, in January of 2001, I had to quit flying because my heart got me. So I was assigned to Army Reserve Command headquarters at Fort McPherson. And when they finally told me I had to retire because of my age, they wouldn't let us stay past 60. And so I retired as a reservist, AGR, in November 2005. And as it turned out, I got a job in that same month with Installation Management Command headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, and worked in Crystal City there for a couple of years. They sent me to a school called Sustaining Basement Leadership and Management. And it was a master's level course that I received 15 hours of master's level credit for any university that would recognize that. And then went back to the IMCOM headquarters and became the executive assistant for the director of the reserve component of IMCOM, and was eventually sent to Korea as a developmental assignment and was the deputy DPTMS, which is the deployment, I forget what it all stands for, training and security and mobilization, something. Anyway, so I stayed there for 6 months and came back, and I was responsible for the safety program management at 4 Army Reserve installations across the U.S. And I talked to one of the safety managers one day from Hunter Liggett, which was a reserve Army post, and she says, "Keith, how can you really manage all of these installations when you've never been an installation manager?" So that got me to thinking, and I said, you're right. And a spot came open one day at Fort Knox, Kentucky, to be the installation safety manager there, as well as the Armor Center safety manager. And so I applied for it, and I got it. So I was the manager there for that time, and they had a little shake-up because the Armor Center moved down to Fort Benning. So one of the other people in the safety directorate became the installation manager, and I was sent to finally an official safety course. Now, I had aviation safety before, and that's what qualified me to hold the position. But it wasn't like the 4-month course that everybody else had. And so I went to that course for 4 months and came back, and then transferred from there to U.S. Army South at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And I spent about, 3 years there? I think it was 3 years. And did a lot of travel down to Central and South America, looking over the safety aspects of building medical clinics and schools for those folks. I never did make it to one of the Caribbean islands, but I spent time in Panama, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Colombia, and saw a lot of those places. In Panama, we went from one end of the country to the other, and we had to have Panamanian police escort because there were guerrillas in the jungles that would attack us if we didn't have any kind of police escort. So that was it was an interesting time, and we shared the installation there at Fort Sam with U.S. Army North, which had part of the Caribbean, but they also managed all the units in Mexico, the U.S. and Canada. And so it was an interesting time and good for me personally and professionally. But in 2015, at almost my 70th birthday, I decided it was time for me to retire for good. And so I did that. I pulled the plug and have been enjoying life as a retiree since 2015. I can't believe it's been 8 years since that time.
Well, you look good for your age.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing. So here's a couple questions for you.
Okay.
One is, and I'm not going down a political road, I'm going down the just the facts, okay? Listening to this morning's radio is a good example. I was a recruiter for 136 years. I know I don't look that old, but they were all dog years.
Okay.
And the Air Force has missed its goals so badly that they are moving the age cutoff to the 40s.
Wow.
To the 40s, just on the news this morning. And their goal is only 25,000. Well, I was recruited in 1982, went active in 82, in what they call Project 100,000. And they made their goals then, but they're not making their goals now. So now that you and I are older, what do you recommend for that next door neighbor kid, or that great grandson, or that person down the street who's thinking about going in the military but hasn't made that decision? What would your recommendation be to that young person, guy or gal?
Woke, quite frankly, has killed the military. I would not want to serve in the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy today. And that's just me personally. I hate to get into politics, but I just cannot imagine serving next to a guy in a foxhole, and then the enemy starts coming at you, and this guy next to me goes, "Hey!" gets up and runs the other way. He hasn't learned how to survive in school, because schools don't teach you about civics. They don't allow you to fail, and you have no room to learn how to accept any kind of defeat or gain any kind of courage when there are no consequences to what you do. Teachers have to be abused by their students. They talk back, they curse at them, and there's nothing that a teacher can do to counteract that. And quite frankly, my older daughter is a teacher. She teaches middle school. And these kids are in school all day long on their phone. Tap, 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 tap. And they do nothing. My granddaughter is 15. She spends all day long on her phone. And we said, well, what about homework? She said, I don't have to do homework. I get straight A's. Well, how do you get straight A's when you're on your phone all day? Oh, school is easy. It's nothing.
So not as much challenge there.
There's not as much challenge. My grandson here in Kearney is going in the Marine Corps later on this month. I think probably if a person had to go into service now, the Marine Corps is probably the best choice, because they're not quite as bad off as the Army, Navy, Air Force. They're not quite as bad off as those.
But do you think, I'm thinking, and I understand the comment, because woke is used as a describer by the news media, by the community. So it's just a word in our vernacular. So I understand that part. But what about the need to serve?
I don't think that need to serve is there as great as it used to be, because they don't teach civics in school. They don't teach you what the government is about. They don't teach you the history of this country and how it's had to struggle to survive.
To be where it's at, yeah.
Exactly. They don't teach you about the Civil War. My great-grandfather was in the Civil War, and he lost a leg at the Battle of Atlanta. He understood what it was like to preserve a nation. There's an author, and I'm trying to think of the name right now. It's William something or other. That anyway, he writes books about the future of a country that is divided, that was divided because they didn't have the government knowledge. They didn't have the historical knowledge of the United States. And they went with a woke type society. And so they divided the country like that. And typically the more liberal side of that country in his novels were more violent. They had more poverty. And the conservative side that he writes about were more prosperous, had a better military, and gave its citizens more freedom, actually, than the other side.
With the benefits that you've had both in a military career, very successful as a Chief Warrant Officer 5. They don't have a Chief Warrant Officer 6, so.
Not yet, they're trying.
So the success you had there, and then to carry that knowledge and use that knowledge in your civilian career, do you feel that your success is owed by your training and experience in the military? I mean, you have a little bit more of an advantage because you've stayed in that track for so long. But how do you think that's impacted you in your personal life, in your community, in church organizations, things of that nature? Was it beneficial? Or?
I was fortunate to be able to attend SBLM because it focused on leadership and management. And having served as a pastor in 3 congregations now, the first being in Louisville, Kentucky, the second being in New Braunfels, Texas, and the third now with Grand Island. The Grand Island congregation is a challenge because it's all online. During COVID, we were not allowed to meet together in person. And because of that, we didn't get the donations that were required to sustain the building and the maintenance there. And so we had to sell the building. Well, now we're to the point that we're looking again to see if we can rent space or find a space that we can meet in. And so the management aspects are coming in handy, the leadership aspects are coming in handy, and so hopefully this will sustain us with that group.
Very good. Well, you've gone over an hour. We only needed 30 minutes, but it was very, very, very captivating. Is there any question that you would like to ask?
I have one that's not related to that. It's a pet peeve of mine. How do you feel about us constantly lowering the flag at half-mast?
By the way, I think you and I talked about that.
There's guidelines for when you're supposed to do that. And half the time when I see a flag at half-mast, I have no idea why. So I'm asking around, why is the flag at half-mast? I don't know. Well, you know, and sometimes you find out it's for some soldier that was killed from that town. So I can understand why people would do that. But to look at the official rules, you'll find out there's guidelines. And when you don't follow those guidelines, that's called flag etiquette. The U.S. flag has an importance to me, and it means a lot. You'll find veterans that are along a parade route in a wheelchair, and when that opening time comes through to present the colors for that parade, and that guy in a wheelchair feel such an obligation to stand up for that flag. His patriotism has to be recognized by the correct treatment of that flag always. These guys that kneel at a football game, as far as I'm concerned, should be shot. I would not stand for it if I was a coach. And I applaud those coaches that don't stand for it.
I think I think maybe shot might be a little harsh, but I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I don't mean
They
literally,
certainly-
but.
No, I know that. I do think there's no room for it, and I'm just one generation behind you, or half a generation behind you. And playing football in high school, our coach would not have stood for it at
No.
all. It just would. There wouldn't have been looking at talent or anything else. It just wasn't even negotiable. There's the door.
Yeah,
But I do have a couple other questions to ask you.
go ahead.
You seem to be the kind of guys a little modest. I'd like to know a little bit about your Purple Heart.
I was in the officers club one night. Now, the Viet Cong were called Victor Charlie. And GIs normally shorten that down to just Charlie. And Charlie never hit us after 10 o'clock. And there's another story that goes with that 10 o'clock time too. But I was in the officers club when the siren went off and the rounds started coming in too soon to run out to a bunker. So I dove into a corner. Now the officers club, got hiccups all of a sudden. The officers club had brick around the walls about 5 feet up. From there up, it was bamboo matting, and that was our wall. But the brick was probably 2 layers thick. And I didn't realize I was on top of another guy until he started mumbling the Lord's Prayer. And the round seemed to be getting closer, and I thought, well, it would help if we got some kind of cushion over us. Well, probably from me to you was a big overstuffed chair that had 2 cushions with foam cushions that were about that thick. So I got up, reached over, got those cushions and laid them on top of me. Now my left knee was sticking out a little bit, and this hand was holding one of the cushions like this. And we got a direct hit on the club, and I got a piece of shrapnel in my leg that's still there, and I got one in my hand. And so I had on a brand new pair of pants, civilian pants, that I had just bought at the PX a couple of days before then. So I went down to the medical clinic and I said, you treat these. And he looked at me and he says, oh, you're okay. And he put a Band-Aid on my hand, he put a Band-Aid on my leg. So then the platoon leader, Lieutenant Donaldson, says, they need somebody to go fly the flare ship. So grab your stuff and go get in the aircraft. I said, do I need to change into uniform? He said, no, just get your chicken plate, your rifle, and your helmet and go. So, and chicken plate is a ceramic vest. And actually it's canvas, but this ceramic plate sits in there. It's about maybe an inch thick. And that'll stop a 50 cal, but you're going to get a big bruise if it does. But so I grabbed that stuff, went out to the flare ship, which was a UH-1H. And I'd been flying Charlies and Bravos up until that point. So I climbed in the aircraft, and the guy with me, he was Peter Pilot. And I'd been flying H models before the guns. So we took off and flew around and flew long enough to have to refuel and take off and refuel again and take off. By the third time we were up, I had 5.5 hours in that aircraft and dropping flares out, which is kind of like dropping parachutes out because the ship gets a little light and it starts tipping. But those flares are about 5 or 6 feet long and probably 8 or 9 inches around, and they're hooked to a static line inside the helicopter. And when you throw one out, that static line pulls a parachute out, and that flare is really, really bright. So unfortunately, it was below us. So that's now when I actually received the medal, I was at Fort Walters as an IP, and we had a ceremony one day where they gave out a bunch of medals. I got 2 of them that day. I got the Distinguished Flying Cross and I got a Purple Heart. And as the colonel's pinning the Purple Heart on me, he says, "Where'd you get your Purple Heart, Chief?" I said, "In the officers club, sir." Oh, okay. But 2 weeks after I got these pieces of shrapnel, I went back to the clinic and I said, "Hey, this is irritating a little bit." So I said, "Can you pull it out?" And she says, "Oh yeah, sure, I meant to do that earlier." So he gave me a little shot of lidocaine and took a pair of pliers and pulled it out, and that was the end of that. So I still got the one in my leg. Every once in a while I get an x-ray, somebody will ask, say, "What is that?" So then I got to explain the story.
So tell us about the 10 o'clock story.
The what?
10 o'clock.
Oh, Charlie never hit us after 10 o'clock. And so I thought I was in good shape one night, about 10:30. I went over to the shower, climbed in, and I getting all soaped down. And all of a sudden, off in the distance, I hear boom, 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 boom. Oh, crap. We're going to get mortared. So I raced off as best as I could, as quick as I could, grabbed my towel, ran out about halfway to the bunker where I knew a bunker was. The first round hit. I lost my shower shoes, and the towel came off in my hand. I ran to the bunker, and I couldn't find the door. So I'm yelling and screaming out there as rounds are going off all over the place. And finally somebody inside there says, "Come inside the hooch and the second door on the right." So I finally went in there, and he says, "You're all wet." Couldn't see a thing. It was pitch black. I said, "Yeah, I'm naked too." "Do you know how much room there is in a crowded bunker when you're wet and naked?"
A lot.
So now the DFC was a little different story. That was now Distinguished Flying Cross, in case you're not familiar. I'm sure you are. We were at Chio Rio, and there was a hill that was purported to have an NVA, North Vietnamese Army, headquarters, regimental headquarters. So I got a call, and they said, "Shoot up this hill, right around this clump of trees." So there was one of our units that was trying to go up the hill with a Mike Force. A Mike Force was mountain yards that was made into a kind of a semi-military unit, and we had special forces leading them. So they were trying to go up the hill to get to this NVA headquarters, and so I got the call, shoot up this area. So it was raining and windy, and I went in and shot that place up with my gunship. Got a little bit of ground fire back at us, not too bad. Rain wasn't too bad, and the wind wasn't too bad. But when I landed, a major came running out to the aircraft, and he got to my door and he says, "Hey, have you gotten any medals yet for this outfit?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, I'm going to write you up for one." And so he wrote me up for the Distinguished Flying Cross. And the citation said something about heavy ground fire, heavy wind, and heavy rain, and all kinds of hazards, making it tough to get in there and shoot that up, but I did. And it turns out that it was a regimental headquarters, and they got some good intelligence out of that when they were able to overrun it. And so
you softened them up.
yeah, I softened them up.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much. So my last thing, is there anything else you would like to share? Anything as your great-great-grandson that you haven't met yet, or your great-great-granddaughter that you haven't met yet, and always wondered, what did great-grandpa do in the war, or anything? Is there anything else that you would like to add?
To all the Vietnam protesters, we had an agreement as a country with the country of Vietnam to support it if they were attacked, which they were. We did our best to support that country in their time of need. So you guys that objected to Vietnam and burned our flag and spit on our veterans can just go piss up a rope.
There you go. All righty.